Good evening and welcome. We were just debating about, was this the 24th, the 25th annual Crossfire, but we've been doing this for a very long time in our case studies course, and I'd like to thank all the students who put on this special event as a actually extra credit project for their class. And I want to thank all of our kind speakers who agreed to be here with us in this very busy time, and to thank all of you as guests. I'm Suzanne Fitzgerald. I do teach in the case studies course with Professor Fulgenetti, Professor Schoenstein, and also Professor Moore. I saw them all here tonight, and we do really welcome you to the College of Communication if this is not your home. And I would like to introduce our guest to you and just explain a few things. For anybody that's an outside guest, there are restrooms immediately to this side of the auditorium as you leave the exit doors. We would like to invite you, and I will re-invite you afterwards, to a reception in our conference room out this right door and down the hallway immediately following the Crossfire event. It is a controversial topic, but it is not, we are not going to see any real fights here other than verbal and intellectual debate. So we're happy to welcome you here, and let me just introduce the panelists here. We have a student from our case studies course, Laura Casey. This particular side believes that the media is in fact not biased. And, right? No, I just did it wrong. I knew I did it wrong. I'm sorry. This is the side that believes the media is biased and has a bias and reports that in the news, particularly in news reporting that we're looking at the death of objectivity. We also have Professor Hackney. He is a professor here and is also talking to us as a former journalist. We also have Dr. Basso, who is not only a lawyer, but also a professor of public relations and has been involved as a professor of public relations with the media and in the media for years. On this side, and now I'll get this side correctly, they are defending journalism and the objectivity in news reporting that we have. And this is George Anastasia. He comes to us from the Philadelphia Inquirer, does mostly crime reporting. Professor Larry Litwin, who also served, although he serves as a professor now, has been in the media for many years, and with KYW TV and others, and radio. And also Kate Gamble, another senior from our case studies course. So sit back and relax. We will have an opportunity for questions from the audience following the Crossfire debate. And let me conclude by introducing our interlocutor extraordinaire, Professor Tony Fulgenetti, who originated the Crossfire here and has been an avid proponent of this special event for our class and this means of intellectual discussion, and we really welcome him. And we thank all of the participants and all of you for coming. Go ahead, Tom.
Thank you. Good evening, folks. I think we'll have our sound back on shortly, I hope. I accidentally tripped it when I tried to get the lights out of my eyes. I want to thank all of our guests, first of all, for coming here and engaging in this crossfire, this debate about an important topic. I'm going to read an opening statement that might set the tone for some of the issues that we will discuss tonight, and then this is the way it'll come down. We have two sides here. The pro side here is going to assert that bias exists in the media, not just accidentally, but deliberately. This side is going to rebut that and say it does not. What this is, there will be no shared or no formal presentations by anybody here. They're only going to react to what they hear. I'll tease them with different questions. They will tease each other with questions. And then at the end, you will have an opportunity, probably 15 or 20 minutes, to ask any question that you wish to ask. And they'll stay in their roles and answer the questions. Okay, so a short statement to set the stage. Now, it might be simple enough to simply admit that the media are biased and dwell instead on causes and effects of biased journalism, but not so tonight. We will spend some time this evening asking our guests not if bias in journalism exists, but if it leaks into their reports. We'll also ask whether the profession has sufficient gatekeepers to check for bias, and if the gatekeepers are not themselves biased. This is an important discussion because our Constitution accords the press a special privilege. Some think to be fair, objective, balanced, and unbiased, not to act as public relations people for pet political and social causes they think will make the world a better place. PR people are not objective, nor are they supposed to be. And journalists are not PR people, nor should they be. PR people have the free speech protection of the Constitution for their opinion. And all admit the Constitution also protects journalism. So let's frame our discussion as we begin. We are not here to discuss whether opinion journalism should be objective. That's an oxymoron. We are here to discuss whether hard news reporting has become opinion journalism, if not all the time, hence our death of journalism theme tonight, or most of the time, hence the death rattle we hear coming from newspapers that have turned off the citizenry by deceiving the folks with opinion when they thought they were getting fact. We mourn the impending demise of print news, from lost ad revenues, lack of immediacy in an immediate world, cosmic change in consumers' habit of acquiring news, gravitating instead to the internet, radio, and television, and loss of confidence by citizens that news just isn't news anymore. I remember the avuncular Walter Cronkite, who ended his CBS evening broadcasts with his signature sign-off, and that's the way it is. We now wonder if all along we should have been responding, "No, Walter, that's just the way you see it." So let's begin tonight by claiming that even some journalists themselves think that the media are biased. Just two quotes, and then we'll ask Professor Basso to throw a challenge over to this side about whether these media are biased. One of them comes from the former CBS News president Van Gordon Sauter. In an op-ed published in January 2005, he said, "Personally, I have great affection for CBS News, but I stopped watching it some time ago. The unremitting liberal orientation finally became too much for me. I still check in, but less and less frequently. I increasingly drift to NBC News and Fox and MSNBC." And the New York Times public editor, Daniel Okrent, in July 2004 wrote, "Of course it is. There are social issues, gay rights, gun control, abortion, and environmental regulation, among others. And if you think the Times plays it down the middle on any of them, you've been reading the paper with your eyes closed." So, Joe Basso, and I will take the liberty to call you all by your first name. Thank you. Joe, what have you to say about bias in the media as a public relations person, too?
Well, I'm coming at this from a number of different angles, from a public relations standpoint, and also from a lawyer who's interested in constitutional issues. But what I really see right now is really of a breach of our ethical duty on the side of the journalists and the role that journalists have to play in society. And I think they have usurped that role. What I see is a mainstream media that has really taken on an elitist mentality. That's really permeated throughout all of the media. We have the members who believe truly that they know how to live our lives better than we do, and that they're going to frame the social issues in a way to not only that we have to even agree with the solution, but to have to agree with the premise. I'll give you a great example with that. I look at the issue with global warming. I think that on both sides of the political aisle, people would agree that automobiles that get better gas mileage, reducing emissions, should be the goal. But we're not allowed to agree on that unless we accept the premise that this global warming is actually a reality. And that comes from this elitist mentality that they simply know better than I do.
George, you've been called a lot of things. Have you ever been called an elitist before?
No, but I don't necessarily disagree with that. And I think part of the issue has to be framed this way. I think newspapers and the media in general have to frame the issues. That's what our job is, to frame the issues. And I think, in a sense, we've got to address the issues that are important. And to do that, you make choices. You're constantly making choices. And you're constantly deciding what's on the front page, what's inside. And that, if that's elitism, I'm not going to shy away from that. That's what we have to do. That's what our obligation is. You have to be an elitist. You can't be all things to all people and be effective. And I think that's what's happened in the media, and that's what's happened in this country. And I think we've had 8 years of arrogant incompetence by an administration that attacked the media constantly and undermined what the Constitution is all about. And so if being an elitist is to say, this is an important issue, here's what you ought to be addressing, you as citizens got to determine what's right and what's wrong. And we're not always correct, and we're not always objective. But I think that's what the agenda has to be. Our job is to frame the question, and if that means being an elitist, so be it.
Wow. Oh. Well, could we move you over to this side for a few minutes? Let's stay on the ethical issue then, because it does raise a question that if you think the previous administration was arrogant
And
in
incompetent.
its dealing and incompetent, would that opinion have ever leaked into your hard news stories?
Well, I mean, I happen to write crime, so I don't think I would be writing about that. I mean, I say that if I were a political reporter and I stood up here and say that, I think it would create more of a problem. I don't write about this administration. I write about crime, I write about the mafia, I write about those kind of things. But I think I can say that's my opinion, and if I was writing about politics, certainly it would leak into it. I mean, it's human nature. The goal is to be objective, but everything you do is subjective. When I pick a story to write, who I'm going to interview, what the lead's going to be, who's going to get the highest quote in a story, that's all subjective. That's not new. It's not, I mean, there's nothing new about any of this. I think the only thing that's new is the media in this country has expanded exponentially with the internet and with blogs and with what they call citizen journalism, which to me, I don't quite understand what that is. But all of that kind of stuff has changed the game and changed the way it's played.
All right, George, hold on. What we have to say is, okay, you write crime, but you work in an institution where probably the majority of your colleagues have a particular political bent. It's been reported that
the majority of my colleagues probably vote Democrat. I vote Democrat.
And they're liberal. So what would you say about them covering the political story?
Well, that's not new, is what I'm saying. I mean, I think what this country is drifting toward or heading toward is not unlike the situation in European countries, where you've got papers that are conservative, papers that are liberal, papers that are communist, and the reader identifies and knows that going in, and then you make your judgments based on that. You know, the funny thing, Tony, when you mention Fox and NBC, MSNBC as where he went to get his news to look for the unbiased, that to me is ludicrous in 2009. If you want to talk about Fox and MSNBC, you're talking about the two extremes in the media. I mean, you look at Obermeyer during the election and you look at O'Reilly during the election, and tell me who was objective there. Neither one was.
Well, and think that Van Souder thought that CBS was worse than them.
Well, exactly. But I mean, what I'm saying is I don't think he would say that in 2009. But the point of all of this, I think, is you as the citizen have to make a determination on where you're going to get your information and have to evaluate it based on where it's coming from. But I don't think you look for total objectivity, and I don't think it ever existed.
Wow. Okay. David,
George,
we're going to come to you.
I think
Go ahead.
Did you steal my notes? Because
use mine,
many of the
David.
points, I think we would agree that the idea of the absence of bias, from what I hear you saying, is a myth. That there's always been bias. Is that your
what I'm
point?
saying is the objectivity may be a myth. Bias is something else.
Okay.
You can have a mindset and a political philosophy and still write politics and be unbiased. But whether or not you can be totally objective is a whole other question.
Right,
Well,
because of the idea
Biased,
of-
I think, is to deliberately slant something in a certain way.
So, do you think it's happening? Do you think there are objective people who are biased personally?
There are some, but it's
No,
I don't
truly,
wanna-
George,
you can't.
many?
I'm one.
Go ahead.
All right, Larry, be with me in a second. I cut Professor off. Go ahead, David. Finish your point.
I was
Right
just
with you.
getting to the point of what you were saying about framing. I hear what you're saying. If you've got 8 facts that you need to put together in a story, you might choose number 2 as your lead. I might choose number 3.
Exactly, and
You
that's-
might leave.
is that subjective
out.
or
And that's
objective?
been
It's
going on
objective.
forever.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're not saying that's unbiased.
No, I'm saying that's just the nature of the business.
Oh, well, then let's keep on the issue that Professor Basso raised on the ethics of this practice. So there's bias in people, Larry. There are reporters who are biased. Some keep it out of their stories. Others don't ever make an attempt to do that. Keith Olbermann on the slide that you saw on the screen said he likes to put things in context. Carol Simpson said, of course we tell the people what to think they want us to. So let's raise the ethical question. Here's the way it's framed. Is the bias warranted if the reporter thinks that the bias that he or she has is good for the country, is good for a particular issue, such as abortion or pro-life? Is it okay then for the reporter to say, I have an ethical duty to use my bias in my reporting because as George Anastasia said, the people need the frame, the context.
You're really asking two questions, Tony. A reporter can be biased when he or she covers a story, asking the questions, asking the tough questions. But then you have to flip it. When the reporter then writes the story that gets printed, or in my case, going on KYW News Radio, I am objective when I report that story. Asking the questions to get the answer, because we're trying to get answers for the public. However, I have to frame that question to get the answer that I think the public deserves a right to hear. That's one side. But when I go back to the station and I file my story, I'm filing a story that is objective in that both sides are represented. And when I report, now I'm not going to tell you that when I ask a question, the tone of voice may not be a bit biased, but when I was out on the street and I reported, just even this past year, most people didn't know whether I leaned to the right or the left and whether I was going to vote Democratic or Republican.
Well, stay on this 1 second. I'll be with you. Laura, you get your response to this as well. But if you ask questions to get an answer, how different is that from giving the answer to the question that you want the people to have in their minds because you think it's very important? Is that a working ethic? Is that a situation ethic that reporters use and say, I'm beholden not only to my principles but to the country or to my allegiances to some cause?
I can only speak for myself and the places where I've worked. I ask the question, the newsmaker gives me the answer. Not only do I report the answer that they give me, but my background is electronic journalism. They say it on tape. They say it on videotape. It's their answer. Now, I write the lead in, and I write a bridge, but I will tell you that where I've worked, we were objective. If we weren't objective, you mentioned the gatekeeper in your setup. The gatekeepers where I worked, they had biases too. And sure, the story lineup is just like the front page, but we try to balance the front page. We try to balance our story lineup at KYW. But when we reported, if we were not objective, we did not stay.
All right. In your opinion, are you common or uncommon?
At a mainstream media outlet, I'm common. If I'm working at MSNBC or I'm working at Fox, I would be uncommon.
New York Times.
And say it again?
New York Times. Are you common or uncommon?
For me, the New York Times, they probably lean to the left.
Laura, what's your opinion about the ethics, this ability to take a principle and, let's say, justify it because it's necessary to justify it, as opposed to reporting something you might not even personally believe in?
Well, I'm wondering, Professor Litwin, whenever you say that you ask the questions that you feel, need to be reported, are you asking those questions because you feel that you already know what the answer you want to get from these questions? Because you could ask a question like various different ways, so do you already kind of know which way you want the question to be answered?
Laura, that's a great question.
The answer is?
The answer is, I would say that more than 50% of the time, I already knew the answer. When I asked the question, I knew the answer I was going to get.
And you reported the answer you got.
I reported the answer I got, and if the newsmaker, and I covered education in Philadelphia, and if the superintendent of schools gave me a different answer, I reported the answer. And if there was a flip side, to balance the story, a counter quote, I went with the counter voice cut.
Kate, if somebody were to say to a reporter who inserted bias into a story because of a social cause, whether it's global warming or one of those hot button causes, guns or abortion or something of that nature, and somebody challenged them, what do you think about the reporter who says, okay, but that's your ethics, that's not my ethic, and there are no real external ethics that either you or I need to adhere to. We can make this up as we go.
I think that is a valid point. I think that obviously my objectivity is going to be different from someone else's objectivity. My priorities in life are going to be different than someone else's priorities in life. And I think the key here is understanding that to be objective is intending to keep out your feelings and your personal thoughts. There are no articles here that are reporting on McCain or Obama in hard news that are telling about their biography and saying, I believe that this person should be president. There are no reporters saying that in hard news. That's not happening. We're just reporting about that particular person. So it depends.
Well, I saw George nod his head in agreement when you said, in order to be objective, you have to intend to be objective. But that's not the ontology of it, really. You can intend all day and not be objective. I mean, really, do you want to mean that good intentions are good enough?
According to the definition of objective, it is the intent to keep your personal thoughts or feelings out of it. That is the definition of objective.
So if I sit down at my word processor and say, I'm going to try my hardest, stay down, stay down, stay down. I'm going to write this story, but if it gets out, and I didn't intend it to get out, okay, that's not a problem then.
Go ahead.
Larry, you want to try that?
One word that you haven't used, no one's used, is agenda. Is
Oh,
there
we're coming to
agenda
that.
Oh, okay,
Good, but-
agenda setting.
You want to
Well,
come to that? Is that,
You-
is
you
that
can-
not the bias, is that not part of the bias of trying to set an agenda for the people
Well,
that Carol Simpson mentioned?
we've seen agenda setting since reporting began. But I wanted to throw out agenda setting, but you just said about taming your hand. Objective journalism is accomplished because, especially today with computers and word processors, we can cut and paste. Back in the day when we typed, it wasn't as easy to move paragraphs around to make the stories even more objective than they were. Yes, and the flip side is you can also take a story and you can bias the story. But a key is, depending on the news outlet, is there an agenda? I will tell you, I have never, ever, in all my years of being a reporter, was told how to cover a story, ever, where I worked.
Well, yes, and we use the New York Times as an example. Many of the newsrooms, the editors and the reporters are of the same persuasion, so they're not going to tell you what to do when they already know what you're going to do, essentially.
Then they wouldn't hire me.
No, they would hire you because they hire people that, you folks work in the journalism office. Tell me, George, is the hiring done with any political agenda in mind? Suppose somebody said, I am a conservative Republican, I want to work at the Philadelphia Inquirer or the New York Times.
I don't think that's an issue. That's
You don't think so?
No, and I think people
Coming over here in a minute.
people overestimate the whole idea that the media sets an agenda. It's much more haphazard than that. It's about covering events and covering the news, and a lot of times it's flying by the seat of your pants. And if you want to say there's an agenda at Fox or an agenda at MSNBC, I would tend to agree with you. But even if you want to take the New York Times and the Washington Post, there's not an agenda. It's about covering the news. It's about deciding what's important and what's not and laying it out there. And if some bias or subjectivity comes into it, it comes out of the individual and the way they operate. And the goal of a reporter is to try to keep that out and to be as objective as you can be. But it's an inexact science. And you can't paint all of this with broad brushes. And I think, to go back to what I said originally, the media has gotten so much bigger now, and the operation is so different, and you've got competing forces now trying to one-up one another, and I think MSNBC is just a response to Fox. And both of those places are biased. I had a daughter who used to work at Fox, and the slogan was, "We report, you decide." And then in the office where she worked, which was the research, they used to joke, "We distort, you decide." I mean, that's the nature of the business now, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing. This whole idea of community journalists, whatever the hell that means. I mean, maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe everybody should have their opinion out there and put it out there on a blog, and we can all evaluate it all. The problem is with the filters, and I think the institutions you're talking about, the New York Times, the Post, the Inquirer, there are filters in place to guard against bias and to strive for objectivity. And I don't think those filters are in place in a lot of these other places. And so, you can attack this on a lot of different levels.
Well, George, let's, the proof is in the research. So we have a couple of researchers here on this side. 3 of you, as a matter of fact. Okay, let's say, how would we ever prove George's assertion about agenda setting? Agenda setting is a mental thing. You have it in your mind, you set out, you cover a story. Probably one of the techniques that most of the people in this room know about would be a content analysis. Suppose somebody were to go to one of these papers and do a content analysis on their work product, and the work product steered in a certain direction. Would that be sufficient to say, oh, the paper had an agenda, or not? I mean, can we do it scientifically so that folks can say, no, there's no agenda. It just happened that all of these stories are going down this path. Joe, let's start with you, and then David.
Before I begin, George had mentioned that you report on the mafia, but you're not a political reporter. After January 20th, you'll be reporting the Chicago Mafia out of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
That wasn't objective.
No, I know.
Proving the point. He's a PR person.
Exactly. Well, that is sort of my point, is that for years journalists have criticized public relations people for the fact that we spin the story, we distort the information, and they were the purveyors of the truth. They were going to somehow get to the true story, when in essence they do set the agenda and they frame the story in a way that makes people think a certain way. There's a duty, there's an obligation in society that journalists have, that and maybe it's an unwritten code, but if you don't report things in a factual way, where you allow people to make a rational decision as to what their beliefs are, you frame it in a way, you become nothing more than what they criticize
Let me
us
ask
for
you.
being
Let
all
me
the
ask you
time,
this.
being a public
Let me ask you this.
Go ahead.
I've been spending a lot of time the last 3 months covering the Fort Dix terrorism trial. I sit in the courtroom for 8 hours and listen to all the testimony and the cross-examination and the direct examination. I go back to my office and I'm told, give me an 18-inch story. Now, how do I frame that? I got to pick what I think is important and try to be objective with that. But I can't give you, the reader, everything that happened that day. I can't give it all to you. So all I got to do is pick out what I think are the high, and that's a subjective decision on my point, and I try to convey it in an objective way. You can apply that to almost any news story that you want. And it's not a question of trying to make people think a certain way. The decision is what, given this event, it's the old thing, all right, you were at an event, you're sitting around a kitchen table, what happened? What do you say? Say it in 10 minutes. Say it in 5 minutes. Say it in 18 inches. And try to do that. It's over 40 seconds. It's not, you're making out, I think you're conveying an idea that there's this agenda and there's this secret plot to influence and control people's minds. It's not like that at all. It's much more haphazard, much more haphazard.
But it's probably much more subtle, but is it no less real?
I don't even know if you can codify it, Tony. I mean, you can go through and you analyze the New York Times, and at the end you're going to say that's a liberal paper. Is that news? I mean, we all know it's a liberal paper, so what? As long as you know it when you're reading it, what's the difference?
Oh.
I'm going to watch Fox. I know it's conservative. Listen to O'Reilly. I'm going to say, all right, he's a conservative guy. I don't agree with what he's saying.
But the difference is that O'Reilly comes out and he admits that he is biased. And so does Limbaugh, and they all
I
do.
don't think
They
so.
all
I
do.
don't
Where the Times is coming across as America's newspaper.
Well, there is a difference between hard news, this mixed bag in the middle, and then pure opinion people. There is a difference. But, David, we really need to stay on this point about whether we could prove this or not. I'm going to ask, in the beginning I mentioned 4 things, and there's been dispute about these 4 things.
Right.
So get back to this content analysis. Is there a way to demonstrate it to anybody so they would say, okay, we see that we've been doing this, so what? These are the 4 things, and Laura will have you weigh on this as well.
Mm-hmm.
Fair, objective, balanced, and unbiased. Is it true that those 4 things, that we can expect those 4 things from the constitutionally endowed press?
Doing a content analysis.
First, can we expect it from them? Because there's some dispute about whether all 4 of those are necessary to be an objective reporter.
Right.
See, George, as you're thinking about that, George said, well, how am I going to cover that story? Maybe he doesn't like the state administration, and he's going to talk about the prosecutor doing a sloppy job in his 18 inches. And so maybe his agenda gets in that he wants to nail the administration because that's what he wants to do. You didn't do that, George. Okay. So, David, how objective does he have to be?
I think he has to be fair.
Fair.
I don't
Define fair?
Defining fair by, at least from the best of his ability, being able to communicate what is being discussed in that courtroom from both the defendant and prosecutor's
2
side.
sides.
Yeah.
He
When I say that would be the fair, but I'm
Let's
not sure he does
George,
that.
George, just hold on.
Perhaps not in every story. You may have to take the entire coverage of the trial to do that, and then come to the conclusion of whether George was fair.
Can we do a
If
quick-
you took it one day at a time, I think you could probably show it's not fair.
And can we do just a quick poll, yes, yes, or no, down this side, because I have to get back to him? Fair. An obligation to reporters to show
Absolutely.
both sides of the story?
Yeah.
In all stories, George?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, I've already said yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Yes. All right. David, Laura, could you take up objective, balanced?
Well, I feel that just because a story may be balanced and you may be portraying both sides doesn't exactly mean that it's accurate. Whether, the facts are accurate for both sides, whether you kind of skew the audience's perceptions about what is being reported. I know George had said earlier that citizens must determine right from wrong. Well, how are we as citizens supposed to determine right from wrong when we're not in the courtroom and we can only determine it from what the reporter or the journalist is reporting to us? Because we can't sit there for 8 hours every day and listen, whereas you can. So we as citizens can't really determine right from wrong. So just because a story may be balanced doesn't mean that what you're saying in your story is accurate for both sides.
Balance and accuracy. So accuracy is another issue.
Well,
Let's kick it back to this side for just a second, because I do want to throw in my deceased mother-in-law. Because, George, you did say, oh, it's up to the people. The people should know Fox News. The people should know MSNBC. But are there not sheep-like people out there who genuflect to the media? My mother-in-law used to say, I said, Mom, why do you think that? And she says, well, ABC News, Peter Jennings said so. And didn't Walter Cronkite tell us that's the way it is? Do you really think, George, that most people out there are that discriminating, that they could make the decision you're asking them to make?
Many are not, but it's the same argument you're making about journalism. I mean, there's an obligation for a citizen to be informed and to make themselves informed. And if they don't, that's on them. It's not on me. All I can do is give you some options. And, I mean,
So they're available for manipulation. Are they?
politicians manipulate people every day.
But they're not, those politicians, they're not in the Constitution the way you are. Go ahead,
I have
Larry.
a question.
Go ahead.
All right, you mentioned Peter Jennings. I can't speak for Walter Cronkite, but I can speak for Peter Jennings. Are you saying he was not fair, that he was biased? Or are you saying that the reporters who reported on the ABC Evening News, and now it's World News Tonight, are unbiased? Who is it the front person? Because here's why I say this.
He's executive editor, too.
Well, he's executive editor, but I can tell you, I don't want to give my age away. Well, I've done it already. I worked on that show when Peter Jennings was there the first time. And I will tell you that in the 3 years I was there, no one ever came down and said how we were to write a story.
So what about him? What about Peter himself?
Well, when he did Q&A, that's another, and he didn't do many live Q&As. The Sunday show is different because that is a little different. But you've got to look, when you're talking television, you have to take a look at who's fronting it, whether it's Walter Cronkite or Peter Jennings or now Charlie Gibson or Katie Couric, Bob Schieffer. I mean, there are a lot. But the people who write the show and the people who line that show up, and it's just like a front page, as I said before, I know some people who work on it, none of them has ever been told, this is how you're going to write that story. Now, when you cut the tape, sure, the way you line it up might be a little different. I'm talking about lining up the video. But I'm just telling you my personal experience. That doesn't mean there's that bias in there.
Larry, I'm not sure if it was, I don't recall, if it was Brokaw or Rather, when somebody went down to cover a story in South America and came back with the wrong story, they sent them back and said, it's not the story we want to run. And they were told specifically to come back with a specific story. So it happens, doesn't it?
Oh, I'm not going to tell you it doesn't happen. But when you're on the evening news shows, which are going to be a dinosaur pretty soon, they're not going to survive. I would say in the next 5 years, I believe network evening news will be gone, and maybe local news will be gone too. But I'm not going to tell you it doesn't happen, but I've never witnessed it. No one ever told me to do it.
Kate, this business comes back again to the reporter. There are some reporters, a couple of them like Katie Couric, Dan Rather. Dan Rather has said the following. He says, when somebody doesn't like the way I report, they call me biased. So here's the question we need to explore. Why does it seem as though so many journalists, when they are criticized, call the criticism bias and not take the criticism and say, is there something going on in my reporting? Am I leaning this way? Or is it already known to them that they're leading, and this is just a defense mechanism to say, No, you don't like the way I'm telling the story, you right-winger, you pro-lifer. You don't like it, therefore you're calling me biased, where the story might have been the other way, and it's a legitimate criticism. Why is it that so many journalists, Quirk, Rather, many others, do this, deflect this criticism?
I think that a key thing here is that when you decide to become a journalist, when you start being involved in journalism, from the beginning you know that you're interested in telling the news, telling the truth, seek the truth and report it. That's what you want to do. And journalists often face so much criticism for reporting so many things. I mean, the truth of it is, there is a lot of responsibility that does exist on the audience and the reader. And it's a question of to what degree does it exist? I mean, if for instance, let's say every single paper reported the exact same story, the exact same amount of news on this subject and that subject, there'd be one paper, there'd be one radio station, there'd be one news station. That's it. That's all there is. I mean, when you talk about journalists being criticized, it's the number one thing that they probably are criticized for. It's really no surprise. I'm sure that whenever that happens, they do probably look at their paper and say, hey, have I reported this incorrectly? Have I been biased? But most of the time, if you're a journalist, if you've been doing journalism, if you're reporting hard news, chances are you know what you're doing. If people don't like the way you report it, it's true. The first thing they're going to say is you're being biased.
Well, it sounds as though you're introducing something like flavor. You're giving people a flavor in the reporting, and then you're in some way you're hoping that they take the flavor. Like my mother-in-law, you're giving her vanilla, and she says, oh, okay, is that the flavor that you want? Somebody else in another network, as you were mentioning, reporting the same story a different way is giving them a different flavor. So is this flavoring of the story, you expect the people to discriminate or just to accept the flavor?
I don't think it's really about flavor. I think it's if you care enough about an issue, any issue, you're going to go to multiple sources to find out information on it, if that matters to you. I mean, for instance, if I'm reading all of my news from ChristianScienceNews.com, in my opinion, that's objective. In my opinion, that might be where I get my news. I think that's fine. Somebody else might argue, absolutely not. That's not hard news. That's completely biased. But in my opinion, it's objective.
I'm trying to find a pure journalist. Have you ever written a story in which you did not add flavor?
I guess what I'm saying is, I mean, how would you define flavor?
It's your predilection to have the people have a certain attitude when they're finished reading your story. That they will think a certain way about the issue or the characters in the story or whatever. It's your view to become their view.
Well, it's sort of like I said. I mean, if you care enough about an issue, it's not just going to be one story that you're going to read about it. It's not just going to be my flavor. You're going to say, okay, I read this today about, you know, whatever issue, whatever social issue, global warming, for example, if that's what we're going to go with. I read a scientific report that said global warming exists. It's increasing this much % a year. If I care enough about that issue, you know, maybe I read that scientist's flavor, but I'm also going to go to another news source and figure out, is that what really matters? You know, is that true? Do I agree with that? Is that the case?
Joe, let's go to one of those social issues like global warming for a moment and just talk about this public that has to consume this news and make up their minds about this. There is a big issue that's in this room tonight, and George has already stated about a liberal press as opposed to a conservative press. Forget the other tags. I want to explore philosophically for a moment why that's so. One of the theories that was advanced during the recent campaign with Obama winning the election was that many of the people in the executive decision-making in the newsrooms grew up in the 60s, and this became the fulfillment now of everything they worked for. But I want to pose another theory that people say and see what you think about this, and we'll come down this side to see it. To be liberal is not to be pejorative. To be conservative is to have standards, and then you are by necessity pejorative because somebody doesn't reach the standard. You say you did not reach the standard. The media do not want to be criticized. They do not want anybody not reading their stuff or listening to them or viewing them. And the best way to get that is not to disagree with anyone, which means progressive, liberal, whatever you want. To that extent, global warming comes along, and it's the in thing to report, whether or not the reporters even know how it's happening. So do you think that the media generally are liberal because of this philosophy that I will not judge anybody else, and therefore all my stories are going to be acceptable to everybody else?
Partially, but I also think that going back to the other issue that the media has come about because of their orientation, because of their own life experiences, that they have their firm beliefs.
But what
and they
is
have the
that? What
platform.
is it that makes 95% of them lean liberal? What is that experience, that orientation? Is it the J school
Where'd you get that 95?
Yeah, I don't,
of the newsrooms? There are studies about newsrooms being 90%. They cheer when Gore almost won. They erupted in cheering.
You said
90% of the New York Times newsroom,
Oh, you said 95% of the newsrooms.
the people in the newsroom.
Oh, okay.
The people. People in the profession is what we're talking about, because they're writing the stories, or they're gatekeepers. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think it trickles down, though. I mean, there's a power base that has set this tone, that said these are the beliefs, and if you're gonna join that selected group, you have to fall in line, lock, step, and barrel, and follow that line. You know, we brought up this issue of global warming. That's an issue, I think, that has been so distorted in the media because information is not presented in a rational way. There's scientific evidence on both sides, and there's rational debate, but it's framed in a way that, again, I think most people would agree on a solution, which is the solution is that there's maybe a problem with we'd like to be more conservative in our consumption. However, if you don't agree with the premise, then you're not allowed to join in the solution, and I think that's indicative of this philosophy that kind of comes down from the top.
I tested that in my graduate class last year. I asked people, would people who believe in that human-induced global warming was true be satisfied if a person actually practiced all of the things that the global warming alarmists want practiced, but did not agree to human-induced global warming? It would not be enough for them. You had to admit to the premise and do the practice.
Exactly.
David, what is your opinion about this, the agenda setting and the bent?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt there is agenda setting. However, I don't think there's a Politburo sitting somewhere saying, all right, for this 6 months, this is the direction we're going to go. What I think happens is it comes from a set of experiences of the people within the newsroom, just coming together and deciding what types of issues, what types of stories are most likely to appeal to their audience. What the concern that I have on agenda setting is that what I see too much is that when it appears in the New York Times, 24 hours later or 12 hours later, I'm seeing it on ABC, CBS, and NBC. I've often thought that if the New York Times went out of business, we'd have a half hour of dog stories and happy news stories on the networks because they wouldn't know what to cover. So I think that's where the agenda setting. So the idea, though, where I would have to again agree with George, is that there isn't a group sitting somewhere and saying that that these are the stories that we should cover. I think that there is little doubt, though. I remember something Larry King once said. He said, you know, before he went in the news business, he was a conservative, and being a reporter made him a liberal. So there might be something that happens as a result of the process of reporting that does tend to evolve people's views into a
You
more.
better tell him
conspiracy
you have to
theory.
tell him who Larry Kane is.
Oh, I'm sorry. Larry Kane used to be the anchor of Action News. Oh my God, you're right.
Yes, you're right, Larry. All right, George, you want to react to this there's something in the water theory?
Well, one, and I said this earlier, I don't think there's anything wrong with agenda setting. I think that's just the nature of what happens here.
But
in terms of
George, do you
why-
agree that it's happening? Because earlier you
Well,
said you didn't think it's happening.
No,
you agree
I
it's
didn't say. I don't think I said that. I said you set an agenda every day.
Okay.
Agendas are set. You just determine what you're going to cover, where it's going to go, that kind of stuff. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. That's where it comes back to the whole idea of I don't have any problem being an elitist. If you're in the newspaper business and you're an editor, you're making decisions every day on what you think you ought to know and you ought to read. And if you're going to be good at it, you got to have the guts, or whatever word, to make those decisions and to stand by them. And it's going to piss some people off. But so what? I mean, that's just the nature of all of this. But in terms of why are we, more of us are liberal than conservative, I think it's the nature of if you get around power and you get around people in power and you get around whatever you get around, whether with me, with the FBI and the U.S. Justice Department, or if you're covering the banking institution, and you see people in power and you want to speak truth to power, that's what this is about. And the other thing is, and I just throw this out there, I mean, the goal is to be objective, and in a purest sense, what journalism is the search for the truth. And on our best days, that's what we do. But day in and day out, we don't know what the truth is. We got a lot of facts. And you got an editor saying, when are you going to give me that story? And you write the story based on the facts you got today, and 2 days from now, the facts are going to change, and you're going to do another story. That's just the nature of the business. And I mean, day in and day out, what we do when we're good is we enlighten, we inform, and we entertain. We're not finding a cure for cancer. We're not practicing brain surgery. But when we try to be objective and we try to be fair, and sure, we use flavor. If you want people to read, you got to have flavor. The only time you don't have flavor is when you're writing about a 3-car accident with 6 people dead. Then it's a straight news story. But if you're writing something else, you want to get somebody to come into the tent, obviously. And writing is a big part of this. And that's one of the reasons I love this job, is it's more than just throwing out facts. You can be creative. And all of this comes into play in what we're talking about.
Well, we're the conspiracy theory, fine. Everybody admits there's no conspiracy. Be right with you, okay? Because Laura, I have a hot topic for blogs coming up, which George kind of raised, the citizen stuff, in a minute. But to get over to this side again, there's no conspiracy, just as there's no conspiracy in the university here. Everybody knows the university professors are liberal. Can I say 90%, Larry, and be accurate about that? But there's no conspiracy. They don't meet and say, let's all go into the classes and teach all of the students liberal philosophy. It's the same way. It's not a conspiracy. It is just there. And I think possibly that other theory that was advanced is that that's progressive. That's let everybody do what they want to do and nobody criticizes you. But you were dying to say something.
I just wanted to say something because George touched on it, and that is whether it's KYW in Philadelphia, and if you're from North Jersey, it would be WCBS and WINS because they're all owned now by CBS, but it was Group W in my day. We would go in at 1:30 a.m., and we would establish our broadcast day because the mention was made about it's in the paper, then it's on radio, and vice versa. But we would spend, and Lauren Lipton is still the editor at KYW, the morning drive editor, and I say she's the most powerful person in Philadelphia because she establishes the top story, and we flip it at 5. They flip it at 5 a.m., and that's when they go with the top story. But I can tell you that more times than not, hours of debate in that newsroom with about 5 people would decide the story lineup and what is our top story of the day going to be. Sometimes that top story jumps right out, but other times it doesn't, and there would be some pretty difficult, some pretty knockdown, drag-out arguments in that newsroom. You didn't check in with the New
York Times from the evening before?
Oh, no, we never, no, we did not. No?
A lot of the studies say so.
We look at the wires, but I can tell you we didn't.
Okay, I need to switch topic for a second. This is for Laura and Kate. We'll start with Laura, and it has something to do with what George raised earlier. Journalists having blogs. And whether or not, I suppose the issue would be whether a journalist revealing himself or herself on the blog does not tell the audience, when you read my story, you better know that this is my political or social philosophy, and that's where I'm coming from, and it can't be helped, but that's the way it is. Do you think it's a good thing, a poor thing, what?
I think it's okay for people in general to have blogs, but when it comes to journalists having blogs, I mean, during the day, they write for their newspaper, they report what they're supposed to do in an objective way, but then at home, when they go home at night, they're writing a blog, which is just pasting their opinion, because blogs are all opinionated. They're posting it everywhere, and so everyone reads these blogs and says, oh, well, this journalist thinks, in a very liberal point of view, but then the next day they go and they read their article, and it kind of skews the audience's perception about how this journalist is really reporting.
Now, we really have to hear from this side. Everybody, starting with Kate, we really have to know, is it a dangerous thing? Is it an okay thing that reporters reveal themselves? whether it's a poll taken in the newsroom about who you donated to or whether you have a blog. What do you think?
I don't think it is harmful. I think there's a difference between work and what you do at home. There's a difference between hard news and your opinion on a blog. It's very different. My personal opinion is that it really shouldn't matter what your opinion is. If the audience is going to take that and look at what you wrote on your blog and the next day read your article and skew it, that's the audience skewing it. That isn't you doing it. That is the audience. That is your readers deciding what they want to hear.
Does it ever put into their minds your philosophy for the next story they read about you, the next hard news story? Well, the audience reads your blog and knows where you're coming from on gun control.
Okay.
And then you write about gun control. And they wonder, is this fair, objective, and all of the other words that we're using? Is it harmful to the profession that they reveal themselves this way? George?
Well, in a certain way, it's more honest. It's more honest for a reader to know what your bias are, what your thoughts are on a given topic. But I think it's dangerous because you're blurring the line between being an objective reporter and being someone who writes opinions. And that's always been differentiated in the newspapers, and I think what we're seeing with the new media is the line is getting blurred, and we've got people who are writing objectively and then writing opinion, and it never used to be condoned. There was two different churches, and you couldn't be in both.
Yeah.
And I think what's happened with the new media is everything's getting blurred, and it's
Larry, do you think it's dangerous?
There was, well, if I were a journalist doing a blog, it would be like a column. So I would try not to tip my hand. But there was a controversy here in the Philadelphia market in radio not too long ago. George, I'm sure, remembers because he appears on Michael Smerconish's show. But Sal Paolantonio on ESPN said to his good friend Michael Smerconish one morning, "You, Michael, are not a journalist." And Michael went really off. And so, because he's a commentator and he's right-wing, but he's really moved a little bit to the center, the controversy and the debate began. What is a journalist?
exactly, yeah. I mean,
So-
that's being redefined, I think.
Well,
I consider
Sal was-
George as a journalist.
Yeah,
I
we
was
probably
too.
do.
David was back in the day.
But why were Smerconish
No. Before he came
In the
here,
day?
we were together. He covered me, so we went to school together. I'm not.
So let's be open about it. Why was Smerconish so upset? He's not a
He believes
pure
he's a journalist. He believes he's a journalist.
So he's defining it.
No, that's what's happened. Is the whole definition of what a journalist is been changed and I don't want to say distorted, but different people have different definitions now of what journalism is and what a journalist is. And O'Reilly might tell you he's a journalist, or Obermeyer. They're not. But they can claim to be.
And how are we deciding how to define?
Well, I don't know.
journalists? Who's setting those rules?
Let's talk about that. I mean, that's the question. What is journalism?
Well, what is journalism? We're going to turn this over to the audience in just a moment. I'd love to hear from a journalism student about what you're told in class is journalism. We tell our PR students that you're opinion formers. You are in charge of forming public opinion. I don't know what the journalist students are being taught.
But I wouldn't go that far. I don't think that's...
For PR people? PR people.
Yeah,
We're definitely opinion shapers. That's who we are. Joe, do you want to weigh? What do you think a journalist? No, here's the question, and I guess we could wind up with this. I hate to wind up because we're not winding up, but let's just say what you think it should be and what you think it is. George has already alluded to the fact that it's changing already. What do you think it is today? What is it today to be a journalist?
A journalist as opposed to a commentator.
Yes,
And there's opinion pieces in journalism that are okay. But in the truest sense of a journalist, I believe it is someone who is, as we talked about, balanced and fair, someone who is going to present factual information, all sides of the issue.
With or without an agenda?
Without an agenda.
Okay, I'm going to get...
Without an agenda, because if not, then you're nothing more than a PR
Public
person.
relation person, right.
That's right.
I think a journalist is anybody who has the ability to reach an audience with either news or opinion. I think when the framers of the First Amendment had in mind was open communication, whether it was somebody printing a broadsheet and going around town and tacking it on trees, or perhaps sitting at a computer someday and posting something on a blog. I think that is the press, and that is journalists. We do have an important responsibility, though, to distinguish people who are simply putting their mental diarrhea, excuse
Yeah,
me, on a
you're-
blog, and as opposed to people who are
You're
like George.
technically correct, David. That's really what it was supposed to be originally. We're trying to just refine it now as to hard news journalism. Laura, what is the journalist today?
I believe that they should present factual information, and like George said earlier, it's a search for the truth. They should be searching for the truth, but at the same time, he said something about they are there to entertain, which I understand that, you know, you have to draw your readers in. You want them to read the paper that you're writing for, but in order to be a journalist, I think that you really need to leave, if you're actually going to report hard news, you need to leave opinion out of it in order for it to be considered good journalism.
Okay, we're coming down on this side, and then we're going to open it up to the audience as quickly as we can. George, what's a journalist today?
A journalist today is different than a journalist of 40 years ago. A journalist today is somebody who reports the news and I think tries to write it in a way that people want to read it. And when I talk about entertaining, that's one of the things I mean is you got to write in a way. The media is so large and there's so many different avenues where people can go to find the news that you got to find a way to bring somebody into the tent. So I think a journalist has to be, in my estimation, a good journalist is a good writer. And you can tell a story in such a way that people want to read it, even if it's not a topic that they're that much interested in. That's, I think, the key to good journalism.
Harry, what's a journalist today?
Journalists today, well, it has changed, and it is entertainment. That was one of my complaints about radio, one of the reasons I left, because we were using music and bumpers and sound effects, and they're still doing it today. But still, a journalist today is going to present both sides of the story, and they're going to be ethical, and if they are not going to be ethical, they have to decide whether they're going to stay in that job or whether they're going to pack it in and go someplace else and hope they can find someone who, pardon me, who supports them.
So in your definition, you put fairness up pretty high.
Oh,
Of those four
I
things.
can tell you what I wrote down early on: fairness, objectivity, balance, and we are truth tellers.
Truth teller. Kate, what's a journalist today?
I would have to agree with Larry. I think that
You're allowed to say that today.
it's difficult to get used to.
Today.
I think that a journalist is someone who's going to be fair, objective, balanced, someone who's going to tell both sides of the story. But I also agree with George in that the definition of journalism is changing. The definition of a journalist is changing. You go to some mainstream news websites and you see there's a specific section for anyone to write anything they want. Anyone who has taken a picture or a video with their phone can put that up there and consider it a news story. And it once again, it is the reader's responsibility, it is the audience's responsibility to sit there and say, is this news to me? Is this, is this newsworthy? Does this count?
In another conversation, we probably should come back and talk about how the courts would protect anybody doing that full protection of the Constitution and call them a journalist by postings. We're now going to turn this over to the audience. We welcome your comments. There are microphones in the audience. And just so I can allow the professors who taught the course as a courtesy, I'd invite Professor Moore and Professor Schoenstein if you have a question first to the audience, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. To the panel, please.
Well, just one quick one, probably addressed to this side here, and that is that would you agree that in public relations it's a common strategy to use the media and their so-called objectivity to build credibility for your organizations, for your spokespeople and whatnot. That in fact using the media, to get the media to look at a story and then to report on the story, and then perhaps even to build that into editorial report is a very valuable commodity in public relations. And that depends on this so-called objectivity that's over here.
Yeah.
So is the suggestion that somehow there's something wrong in that transaction that has historically existed between media and the people that they cover? Is there really something wrong in that transaction, or is that not just the way it is?
But it's honest. It's open and
Use the
up
mic, John.
front. It's honest. It's open and it's up front. I'm presenting this, and we know that it's coming from a biased viewpoint. I'm writing it for my client, and the role then of the journalist is to discover the other side of the story and craft the story. I mean, technically, by their definition, the arbitration memo that I wrote for the judge last week, which made my client out to be a hero, was journalism, because it was as objective and as I could come up with.
Refer to the external credibility or the third-party endorsement that results when the media cover a story. And that there's a value in that transaction, not just to public relations people, but to organizational communication. and to communities at large, that we need somebody, whether it's traditional journalists that we've heard from here, or maybe it's a new media journalist, that we need to have somebody passing judgment and rendering opinion. And maybe that they may be actually commentating in certain cases, or in other cases they may be reporting, and through that process framing an issue or whatever, but it's an outside viewpoint.
Professor Moore, isn't it true that they are most valuable to us when they are most objective about what we give them?
That's what I'm saying. And so is that not, in fact, just part of the process? And while it can go askew at times, it can get out of whack when we have media on either side that may go too far. But isn't that part of the transaction? And what we're really talking about here is learning how to manage that transaction in a new media environment where a lot of these rules and roles are changing so fast we can't keep up.
Okay.
That's
Professor Shevington? Student, you want to give your vote over it? Go ahead, please. Microphone?
It's working.
Okay.
Okay. I know earlier we were talking about like filters, so to say, to help out objectivity. Well, my question is involving the 24-hour news stations and how news has pretty much become updated to the minute now, especially with the internet. And with this coming about, do you think that the filters are sort of being destroyed or being weakened, where maybe a reporter doesn't have enough time to see what is important about the story, or he just doesn't have a story, period, so he starts stretching for sources, or he hears about something that might happen, and all of a sudden now the story is being skewed by just speculation?
To whom do you want to address that question?
Both sides, pretty much.
We'll take
Well, I can tell you, working at an all-news radio station, we were 24/7, and going back to the 1980s and the early 90s, I'd be out on a story, and Bob Katowski, a terrific editor, would say, we're going in a minute, we're going in 30 seconds, and all I would hear is my last name, Litwin, go, 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 whether we're ready or not. So we had to, now, I will tell you, we were careful. If we didn't have all the information, and we had to do it in 40 seconds, and I believe it's worse today than it ever. I see so many mistakes on TV, and it drives me nuts. It drives me nuts.
You want to respond to that?
I think 24-hour news cycle is not anything new. The wire services and radio have always been doing that, and the filters are in place. When I talk about the lack of a filter, I'm talking about, basically, for want of a better definition, the new media. For example, I write about organized crime. I'll go on the internet and look up websites that deal with organized crime, and I'll read this stuff, and I say, this is not right. And I know it's not right because this is a topic I'm aware of and I know about. And I wonder how many other topics where I don't know about it, I'm going to read stuff, and what value do I put to it? That's where I think there isn't a filter. And that's the danger of this, the way the media has exploded. I mean, whether you want to say the New York Times is biased or liberal or whatever, there are still filters in place, and there are people who care about getting it right. And I don't think on the internet there are enough people who care about getting it right. It's more about, one, pontificating, and two, just throwing information out there.
And being
that's
first.
what the problem is.
And that can be
And being
dangerous.
first.
And, well, being first, but I mean, what's the good of being first if you're not right?
Well,
But see, that used to be the value of journalism, and that's the but I don't know that everybody aspires to that.
classic example was that a few years ago, WCAU ran with a story that Mayor Green was involved at the highest level. The city of Philadelphia was involved at the highest level. At 5:02, they put the story out. Nobody else carried it. At about 5:13, other stations reported that WCAU was reporting it. Eventually, it came down that he was not, and they had to settle out of court, but they had to get there first without doing a lot of checking.
And who was
Question.
the anchor? Was Larry Kane.
Everybody was fired. Everybody was fired who touched that story except Bill Baldini, who reported it on the street, and Larry Kane, the anchor. Everybody else was fired. Yes, please, in the back.
I would like to ask my question to the side that is arguing objectivity.
Agreeing with objectivity?
Yeah,
This side.
This side, okay. I am fortunate enough to speak many languages, and I look news from France, from England, and from Spain, and I noticed that most news channels get the information from the AP. So the same pictures, the same videos, depending on which you look at TF1 or anything, there's the same images with like a different angle depending on which station you're talking about. So my question is this: how can you argue objectivity in that case? All of them get the information from the same source.
It's a great question. The AP folks on this side, it's directed to you. The AP controls.
Well, the Associated Press, they're journalists who cover the story. Now, the Associated Press is a service that provides material to newspapers the same as McDonald's is a franchise. So newspapers, radio, and TV stations subscribe to Associated Press, as does WGLS, but I can answer the story for the question this way, and I raise the same question, particularly about television and newspapers. When you open a newspaper in the morning, many times we see the very same photographs on page one. We see, they call it artwork. We see the same. You turn to a sports page, you see the very same pictures, and that's because they're photographs from early on because they have to move down the wire, and the papers have a deadline. As far as objectivity, the way those stories are covered, they are journalists who are covering the story. You're going back again to what I call front page balance, which could be biased somewhere, where the editor might say, I'm going to place that picture on the right, I'm going to place it in the center, I'm going to place it below the fold when it comes to print, and the same thing online. It could be how big it is online. But I don't believe that the use of, whether it's Associated Press, Reuters, or UPI, is a bias at all.
But
the
if
bias
it's not,
would come back.
It's not touched, Larry, by the secondary people who get it. If it's given in its pure form the way it comes from AP, it's just one point of view, right?
Well, no, it would still be an objective story.
If it was constructed that way.
Well,
if it were constructed that way.
No different from a local news outlet.
So we're back to the same question.
It's just, yeah, it's the same. It's just that they provide. And by the way, if I could just take 30 seconds, you folks who live in New York, you're going to see a transformation after New Year's Day because several of the TV stations, 2, 4, 5, 7, 9, and 11, I think 3 of them are pulling together. They're going to be sending one camera crew to cover a story, one camera crew, maybe no reporter at all. In Philadelphia, channels 3 and 29 are pulling, and they're going to do the same thing. So when you're talking bias, we're looking at the same pictures.
That's a factor of economics, though. I mean, it's the same thing with, there's a news event, and instead of sending up 3 helicopters, going to send up 1 helicopter because it's cheaper and one camera crew. That's just a question of economics and what's going on within the media business.
Without accusing the AP of biased reporting, which I wouldn't do here, you would say that the story is poison fruit from a poison tree. It just keeps going through the stream. Whoever starts that story picks it up. The way the New York Times also controls the content of most of the stories.
But Tony, you're assuming the story is somehow biased to begin with.
No, I said if it is. If it's agenda setting. If it's not objective. If it reflects the reporter's personal viewpoint. And a lot of those stories do. I asked a similar panel, George, about 10 years ago. There was an editor from the Gloucester County Times here, and I said, come on, isn't there not bias in reporting? He said, no. I said, here's a case. Your reporter is a card-carrying member of PETA. Would you send her to cover a story about animal cruelty? He says, well, probably not, because he didn't trust that she would do it. He said, but don't worry about it. I'm here to check our story. And I said, who checks you and your philosophy? And he said, well, it's got to be up to the gatekeepers to be objective. Question, please. Question. Yes, sir.
I'd say the point of a journalist is to make sure their stories are factually accurate and unopinionated. But I would not say that their selection of the stories has to be unbiased. Not every story has equal weight, and not every viewpoint on a story is equally important. And I'd say in selection of stories, there is a liberal bias to them, but that's a competitive advantage to a news reporter. Conservatism has always been the old ways of doing things, the old guard, the status quo. And to be a conservative news reporter puts you a day late behind stories. And being a more progressive news reporter, you're reporting on things as they're happening and as they're changing. And I just think that gives a competitive advantage that makes stories more interesting and makes it worthwhile to be that way. And to borrow a quote from Stephen Colbert, reality has a well-known liberal bias.
Reality. You want to? Is that a fair comment, or is it? Go ahead.
Well, the only thing I might disagree is that you said that it's more economically viable to be liberal.
You'll get more viewership if you go for the liberal stories as they're happening. Otherwise, you're reporting things that are more or less known.
Seeing that.
Not changing.
Not exactly, because Fox News is doing pretty well. So, maybe there is an audience for conservative bias.
If Fox News is conservative, if you assume every other news station is liberal in comparison, then Fox News is not doing nearly as well as the rest of it.
Oh, well, yeah.
So is this to assume now that journalism has fully gone into the entertainment business, and that's all it's about now, is we're just going to have these wonderful stories that are so somehow we have elevated Rosie O'Donnell to journalism status. God
Well, you know,
forbid.
George had a point. The death of these newspapers
Yes.
is really proving the point that there's so much competition out there, and the ad streams are migrating away, emigrating from newspapers to
Also,
other
I mean, the
venues.
other thing is, good journalism is expensive. Investigative journalism is very expensive. And I work at a paper that kind of made its bones 25 years ago, being one of the best investigative papers in the country, and we're not anymore. And the problem, we had guys, Bartlett and Steele, I don't know if you ever heard of them, we used to joke around the newsroom, they're not publishing this year. I mean, they're journalists, and they weren't going to write a story in the entire year because they were working on something. Those days are gone. Nobody wants to invest the time and energy it takes and come back 6 months later and say, hey, the story's not there. And to be a good journalist, you got to be able to do that.
So, what does it say, George? What's the conclusion to that?
What the conclusion is
about the quality of journalism.
Well, I mean, what the conclusion is what we're seeing. We're seeing multimedia, and we're seeing a lot of surface stuff and not very much depth. That's just the nature of what's happening. Wow.
Well, I was just thinking of the slide we had earlier. I wish we could put that back up of the, whether it was Sarah Palin's clothes or whether it was Michelle Obama.
The contrasting covers of the magazine.
Magazines. I thought that was interesting.
I mean, if you want to talk in terms of journalism in the country, and you want to do some kind of research, look at the way journalists covered the Vietnam War and look at the way journalists were able to cover the war in Iraq. And tell me what was better for the country. Whether you want to say it was a liberal press back in the Vietnam days, and it probably was that better for the country, or was it better to get caught up in this, I'm embedded, and to get wrapped up in a flag, and to be told, don't challenge this because you're unpatriotic? And where are the weapons of mass destruction? I don't know. But I mean, that's what happened with the media. The media got cowed.
Yes.
The media got cowed by an administration that said, if you're not with us, you're un-American. And during the Vietnam War, that wasn't going to happen, and it didn't happen. And I think the country was better off because of it.
Thank you, George. But, wow. But that's just your opinion, right?
Wow.
Question.
I think the facts will back me up, Tom.
Question. Yes, sir.
This question is for this side. If you say that community journalism is damaging the journalism profession, does that give journalists an excuse to put flavor into their writing? What I want to know is, what do you propose journalists and these news media outlets can do to battle these new opinion leaders like Stephen Colbert, who call themselves journalists, or Rosie O'Donnell, who may call herself a journalist? What can the journalism profession do to start to battle these opinion leaders without showing a bias or an objective point of view?
Stephen Colbert doesn't call himself a journalist. He's role-playing every night. He doesn't let his kids watch.
Truthiness.
Answer this though, Larry. Do his audience consider him a journalist? The young people especially, do they consider him a journalist? And do they take news from him as fact?
I can't speak for Colbert, but they believe Jon Stewart is a journalist, even though he's a comedian.
Yeah, so what's that?
So to answer your question, do you have anything?
No, I mean,
can do?
community journalism is a new phenomenon, and it's not unlike Thomas Paine and when the founders of the country. I mean, people put out pamphlets to express their opinions. That's fine. There's probably a place for that. And it's certainly much more democratic. All I'm saying is, if you want to start talking about bias and subjectivity, you're going to find more of it there because there's less of a filter. Not saying it's right or wrong, but this is where we are now, and everybody's got to be aware of that.
Okay. One or two more questions? Yes, sir. There's a mic there.
I've been trying to figure out the right way to ask this because it's kind of weird. When I first heard there was going to be this debate, the first thing I did was look up the definition of objectivity or being objective. And I found there were 8 or 10 definitions. And I tried to figure out which one applied to journalism. And I think my man up there said the right thing about the way objectivity applies to journalism. So my question is, a scientist or a physicist would say that it is impossible to be objective because the very act of observing something changes it. I don't know if William Randolph Hearst ever said it, but I know Charles Foster Kane said, they're going to believe what I tell them to believe. and that was a long time ago. It seems like in the last 20 years, maybe the last 10 years, the attack on, I mean, just the words, the mainstream media, has become some kind of a bad thing. And it seems that there's an agenda behind that. So my question to you guys is, why are we even having this debate? What are you trying to accomplish by attacking the New York Times? When I heard about this debate, I went to the New York Times and I looked at the front page, and what I saw is what this guy said: who, what, when, where, why. But not why my opinion, why something happened, not who thought what. In other words, it was very objective reporting. It seems like this sort of questioning, and dissent's always cool, but it seems like this kind of questioning is trying to tear that down. And the question is, what is going to replace it?
Okay. We'd like to see the front page of that New York Times and do a content analysis on it to see exactly how it was written.
Tony, can I
see how it was written?
Tony, can I just
Go ahead.
one quick comment. Back in 1980, the Philadelphia teachers went on strike for 56 days, and it was ugly. Dave, were you at the Bulletin then? I can't remember.
I was.
David was at the Bulletin, Dave was. I'm going to embarrass him. He was a great reporter. But I remember one comment that was made during a news conference, and it was John Murray, who was the president of the Philadelphia Federation of Teachers, and he said, if they say it on KYW, you know it's true. And he wasn't drinking Kool-Aid, and that's the way journalism was in those days, and we tried, I'm not going to say we were always subjective, but we tried to be objective, and that does fit in with one of the 8 definitions I'm sure that you read.
Joe, you want to take that question?
John Moscatelli would have told you it was Flavor Aid, not Kool-Aid. He would always set the record straight on that. Why? Because we talk about this issue of power. And it's very interesting to think about the New York Times as this, they're objective, which, I think we could have a much longer debate about whether they really do the who, what, when, where, and why. My issue, and one that we haven't brought up today, and I know this is an issue for a whole other panel discussion, is that the attack has to come on a side that is saying that the media is biased, because the ability for people who disagree has been given to us through new media, and yet we hear rumblings that old law issues like the fairness doctrine are considering to being revised. And why? Because it's a way of stifling speech and stifling any other opinion. The Times has a social responsibility, has an ethical duty to report information accurately. And as Tony has mentioned, if we did a content analysis, and many have been done, you would show that they are left-leaning. And that's fine, but be honest and open about it. Okay, new media does have an issue. There is a social agenda there, but they're open and upfront about it, where they're not. And that's where we talk about the death of journalism. The death of journalism has come in the sense that it is projected as the truth, and yet there's an institutional bias in there, and they want to take away our right to even question that by other means, and talk about that we're not objective, and labels that are put on here. And that's where I think the real problem has come in. We have lost the media has set the tone, and that's fine. Be open and honest about it, but allow the debate to come about, and allow us to have our voice and to disagree with their thought processes, because there are 2 sides to every coin, and I think you can look at any issue and make an argument. I think George has, obviously, he has great discontent for this administration, and I would argue point for point with you, and I'm sure you would hail the Clinton administration as the greatest administration in history, and I would argue, vehemently against that.
But he buys ink by the barrel.
That's right.
You
exactly.
Well, the question, though, is what is going to take its place? If you achieve your goal and the New York Times goes out of business.
There are things already, well, there are things already taking its place. All of the other, all the migration to the internet itself is becoming the chief source of information for many people.
Yeah, but is that better
radio.
or worse? I think that's the question he's asking. Is that a better situation? Yeah.
There has to be some sort of.
Well, let's not
But the
make the
goal isn't
assumption
to take
that
them
getting
out.
rid of the New York Times is the worst thing in the world. You can't make that assumption either. Whatever it's going to be. The Wall Street Journal is conservative on its editorial page and liberal on its news pages.
That's true.
On its news pages. It may be one of the balanced outlets, truly balanced. Take one more question in the back, please. Yes.
Considering the fact that all the news outlets are suffering, we have generations of refusing to pick up a paper or watch the news. A good journalist, obviously, is somebody who sells the paper, who sells the news, who gets those dollars in.
No, I don't agree with that.
I thought that was a definition of a good public relations person.
Talk about entertainment or flavoring in the news, or whether you're going to have this bias or this bias. That's all part of that.
George.
You know, where is objectivity when the dollar gets in?
Oh, she's alluding to the fact that if you don't exist, you can't even report.
Exactly. You'll be writing diaries.
You'll be writing, yeah. That's our point. That's our point.
Suffering financially because readership or viewership is dropping. So a good journalist potentially is somebody who brings in an audience. And to bring in that audience, who knows what has to be interjected. When you think about the Franklin Institute right now not being the Franklin Institute, the Franklin, with the exhibit talking about the science and the fantasy behind Narnia. Obviously, science is going out the window. Right?
What's your name? What's your name? Your first name? Carol, if you're right, it's one of the scariest things I've heard so far. And you know why? Because it used to be an axiom. These gentlemen and lady will confess, you never crossed the line between editorial and business. They never, ever crossed. And now you're saying we've crossed it.
My degree is in journalism from Temple University many years ago, and I've seen the change as well.
George, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a newspaper to succeed, in today's world, it's got to reinvent itself. And I think the way it can reinvent itself is by delivering the kind of writing, entertaining and enlightening writing, that you can't get anywhere else. And that's not to say you become biased. It's not to say you're not objective. But it's a different way to tell the story. I mean, and that's, I think, what we've got to find. And if that sells the paper, well, fine. It's to everybody's best interest. But when I say entertain, when I say entertaining, I don't mean it's got to be fluff. I mean, it's got to be written in a way that people are going to read it and laugh, feel empathy, something like that. That's where a newspaper's got to go to succeed.
Then
Because you
label
can't-
it properly.
And label it.
Let's
right.
label it properly.
Okay.
What is the definition
Of a journalist today. Today, right.
No, but I don't know why. I can do that and be objective. I can write that kind of story and be objective. I can write an entertaining story that's objective and that's not biased. Why can't I do that?
Joe's saying the expectation of the audience needs to be met because they expect you to be whatever that is, the objective.
I don't think the audience knows what they expect.
So they are unknowing
Oh,
sheep.
now we're back to the elitism.
They're unknowing
Well,
sheep.
now we'll go
right.
back to the elitism,
right.
exactly, yeah.
They're unknowing sheep. All right, hold on a second. I've been told that we need to close it. So as I try to close, I'm going to give each of the panelists a chance to think of their great final thought, like 10 seconds of the best one-liner you can close with. And because our students are so fast and so quick, we're going to start with our students. Laura, we're going to go back and forth, and we'll wind up with the two folks closest to me. Laura, what's your best 5-10 second conclusion?
Could we let Kate go first?
Kate, go ahead, Kate.
Once again, I just want to repeat, the definition of objective is the intent. It is the intent to keep personal feelings and thoughts out. That's what it is. If we're not dealing with an absolute, we are dealing with the intent.
Laura.
Okay. Well, whenever you take objectivity out of journalism, you're pretty much removing the standards. And so I feel if there's no objectivity, then what kind of standards are you supposed to meet when it comes to reporting journalism?
Larry.
Well, I will stick with the same words I use for public relations: open, honest, thorough, valid. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you that that some of the media insidiously or doesn't allow a bias to leak through insidiously. However, I'll also go back to the same 4 words that I used earlier dealing with this: fair, objective, balance, and we are truth tellers. And we have to get the story out, and we try to present the story giving both sides as balanced as possible, whether it's 45 seconds or 18 column inches. And 18 column inches is a real bonus, isn't it, George?
David?
I'd say the best thing that we can do as consumers of news is to try to rid confirmational bias. So I would suggest all of liberals out there watch Fox News for a week, and all conservatives watch MSNBC for a week. Try and get some balance in your life.
George.
Good journalism is striving to be objective, and we don't always get there. And that's the reality, and I think everybody ought to recognize that.
Thank you, Joe.
Well, I think the word that we didn't discuss enough today was ethics. And it's interesting that we'll talk about the liberal mindset seems to loathe people who are in power positions in business, yet we want to give them unfeathered power in media to set the agenda. And I just think it's really problematic in society.
Thank you. Professor Fitzgerald is going to have a comment for you about inviting you. This has been a presentation of the case studies classes in public relations and the Public Relations Student Society of America. Wish to thank all of our panelists for their excellent comments, and thank the audience too for your participation. Thank you.
First, I think our students have some gifts for our guests, and then after that, we would like you to please exit to that door on your left, my right, and join us for some refreshments in the conference room. Thank you for coming. I did point out that direction. There'll be students going before you. Thank you for coming.